Good evening, and welcome to the last lecture. And today we are going to speak about a benevolent dictator, Mussolini, Berlusconi, and memory wars in Italy. Just over a year ago, on Sunday, January 27th, on the occasion of the commemoration for the Giornata della Memoria, Holocaust Memorial Day, the former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi appeared at the inauguration of a memorial at Milan's rail station. You see here on the track number 21. That was the track from which moved the train to Auschwitz, which recalls the deportation of Italian Jews to Auschwitz. You see another picture of the inside of the memorial. Just before taking a seat and then falling asleep, here is Berlusconi sleeping. Berlusconi had this to say about the Shoah. Italy does not have the same responsibility as Germany. There was, on our part, an alliance that at the start was not entirely conscious. The racial laws were the worst fault of Mussolini as a leader, who in so many other ways did well. It's difficult to put yourself in the shoes of those at the time. Obviously, the government of the time, out of fear that the German power might be victorious, preferred to ally itself with the Hitler's Germany rather than opposing it. And here you find the link for the speech of Berlusconi that I have just read. And there, in just a few short phrases, Berlusconi revealed a number of historical falsehoods and cliches. The fascist racial laws were imposed by Germany and were the only true evil deed of Mussolini, who otherwise had done many good things for the Italians. The words of Berlusconi sparked the immediate indignation of the Italian Jewish community and elicited sharp rebukes by the left. His comments were repeated and stigmatized in the national and international media. Struck by a wave of controversy in Italy and abroad, Berlusconi replied innocently, I quote, "Regarding fascism, I only said what the great majority of Italians believe, but nobody can accuse me of anti-Semitism." For Filippo Focardi, the controversy generated by Berlusconi's comments created an excellent atmosphere for the launch of my book about the Evil German, which was published just a few days prior. I was interviewed by the media, on the radio, TV, very good for my book. But of course, what primarily interests us here is another aspect of this case. How is that in Italy, a political leader of one of the two principal political parties, Casa delle Libertà, who has served as prime minister on more than one occasion, can publicly extol the merits of the fascist regime without any shame and without immediately being forced off the political stage? And is it true that the vast majority of Italians share Berlusconi's view of fascism? There is no reliable data on this latter question, but the results of a survey conducted a few years prior by a popular television broadcast, Shusha, hosted by Michele Santoro, is very revealing. According to this survey, at least 1/4 of young Italians hold positive views of fascism and Mussolini. Berlusconi never was and is not today a fascist, nor an anti-Semite, and neither is he nostalgic about the past. And the same is probably true of the majority of the young Italians who pronounce favorable views of fascism in this survey. What is striking, however, is the presence in all levels of Italian society of an indulgence for il duce fascism, seen as an ultimately good-natured dictatorship which managed to make the trains run on time and to complete important public works. Such an attitude has been present in Italy since the immediate post-war period, above all amongst the bourgeois that had joined in mass to support fascism. They didn't want to be any more fascist, but without having shame of their fascist past. But we need to understand how this sentiment could continue to be so widespread after 70 years of democracy and the Republic. Studying the legacy of fascism, of course, requires the study of the legacy of anti-fascism. In today's lesson, I would therefore like to deal with the relationship between the public memory of fascism and that of anti-fascism, concentrating on the memory wars that have played out over the last 20 years in Italy. Before starting, I'd like to briefly review what led up to this. Thanks to the parties that formed the National Liberation Committee, which led the resurgence against Germany and the Republic of Salò, anti-fascism and the resistance became, after the war, the pillars of the new democratic republican state that rose from the ashes of fascism. In subsequent years, this base of legitimacy was at various times threatened by the anti-communism fomented by the Cold War, given that for many the resistance was irrevocably tied to the Communist Party. However, this base of legitimacy was reinforced by the anti-fascist historiography and anti-fascist cultures, while not in agreement on all matters, underlined the Italian people's non-involvement, if not total aversion to the fascist regime, and reaffirmed the link between the anti-fascism of the 20s and the 30s, the national liberation movement of the years 1943-45, and the birth of the Republic. Despite the challenge in the name of anti-communism, anti-fascism and the resistance remained a focal point for the national memory in the 50s, an era characterized by the hegemony of the Christian Democrats. It was renewed in the 60s with the birth of the center-left governments, expanded to include the socialists, but challenged anew in the 70s, this time from the new left, which considered the resistance a sort of a revolution betrayed that needed to be brought to its conclusion. However, the government of national solidarity, based on the historic agreement between Christian Democrat leader Aldo Moro and Communist Party leader Enrico Berlinguer, claimed this heritage, defending the republic born out of the resistance in their fight against domestic terrorism, both linked terrorism and neo-fascist terrorism. After the kidnapping and killing of Moro by the Red Brigades in 1978, it can be said that anti-fascism and the resistance were embodied by the new president of the Republic, socialist Sandro Pertini, the charismatic and popular ex-partisan. But the 80s were a turning point for the legacy of anti-fascism and the resistance. The 80s mark a radical departure from the previous decade and the public memory, anchoring the resistance and anti-fascism, and the public memory anchoring the resistance and anti-fascism came under fire through historical revisionism with two main aims: criticizing the resistance and anti-fascism, while at the same time softening the fascist experience in Italy. All of this played out on an international stage of rising tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, the so-called Second World War, along with a new wave of anti-communism that swept the globe, including Italy, where it involved not only moderate forces, but also the Socialist Party of Bettino Craxi. These are the years of the so-called Pentapartito, the five-party coalition government that included the Christian Democrats and the Socialist parties, but summarily excluded the Communist Party from the ruling coalition. Just in the mid of 70s, the Italian Communist Party was very, very near the government, not directly involved in the government, but had supported the government, the Italian governments headed by the Christian Democrats. With the beginning of the new decade, in the 80s, the Communist Italian Party was completely ousted, expelled from the area of the government. In this environment, we find widespread attacks on the resistance, largely of an anti-communist nature typical of the First Cold War. The distinction between anti-fascism and democracy, and the accusation of totalitarianism leveled at the Communist Party. In addition, some events carried out by the communist resistance, such as the bombing of German soldiers in Via Rasella in Rome in 1944, prompting the retaliation by the Nazis at the massacre of the Fosse Ardeatine, the killing of fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile in Florence, and the execution of partisans with other political affiliations, as in Porcius in Friuli, marred the public image of the resistance and anti-fascist movement. Furthermore, the killings of Italians by Tito's communists at the end of World War II, and the Italian communist elimination after the liberation of political opponents and class enemies suspected of being fascist, especially in the so-called Triangle of Death in Emilia, serve as counterpoints to any suggestion of fascist violence. The issues receive continuing coverage by the conservative media, and over time they were obsessively repeated in the neo-fascist press. Nowadays, they were echoed in the public opinion, thanks in part to socialist newspapers and magazines, such as L'Avanti and Mondo Operaio, which repeatedly took to task the communists, condemned the communist culture, emphasizing a need to substitute the fascist anti-fascist paradigm with a totalitarian anti-totalitarian one. So, with its challenge of the Communist Party, Craxi's Socialist Party legitimized traditional topics which until now had been tied to the right. This is the very new situation in Italy. The Socialist Party that attacked the Communist Party and in part attacked also the resistance that was the base of legitimization for the Communist Party. It's in a very strange situation because until the mid-80s, we had an old socialist president of the Republic, Pertini, who I have just said embodied the resistance. He was an anti-fascist, a partisan, and in the same party, at the top of the same party, we had Bettino Craxi, who conducted a campaign against the Communist Party, also disregarding the tradition of the resistance. So there wasn't any significant new historical research that served as the catalyst for this contemporary rereading of the resistance. The new interpretation of fascism was otherwise inspired by the works of Renzo De Felice, and we had just spoken about him, at the time the most important Italian historian of the fascism. In the 70s, De Felice endorsed an image of Mussolini's regime as authoritarian, not totalitarian, highlighting the fact that the regime modernized the country and created a broad popular consensus. On board with this rebranding of the regime were a vast array of journalists dedicated to popularizing history, from Arrigo Petacco, Antonio Spinoza, to Roberto Gervaso and Giordano Bruno Guerri, to perhaps the most important of all, Indro Montanelli. The function of these prolific writers, exhibition curators, and television guests, controversially described as talk show historians, was to break down De Felice's interpretation for the general public with the goal of creating an authentic media vulgata. All this place a humanized Mussolini at the center of the regime's historical image. This Mussolini was the embodiment of all the vices and virtues of his people. As such, he was capable of creating a regime in the image and likeness of the country, characterized by a massive dose of rhetoric and amorous intrigues, but with minimal violence and repression. What developed during these years was later defined by one of the greatest scholars of fascism, a pupil of De Felice, I'm referring here to Emilio Gentile, as the retroactive defascistization of the regime. The German Nazis, considered wrongly a perfect model of totalitarianism of steel, were used as a measure stick for which to compare Italian fascism, a process derived from De Felice, thus stripping the Italian regime of repressive traits. The comparison of the fascist years with the Third Reich allowed Italians to distance themselves from the German experience and to redefine their regime in a reassuring and benevolent light. At the same time, there was no attempt to use De Felice's category of consensus to examine the complex relationship between the regime and the people, and the Italian people. In fact, the alleged mass support of the Italian people to the regime, taken as a mere matter of fact, without any critical analysis, was used as uncontrovertible proof of the merits of the regime. They say if the regime had so large consensus, that means that the regime was not so bad. It's just the contrary that we can say in Germany. When Germany discovered the consensus, the German consensus towards the regime, they were shocked. The German society was shocked in the 60s and the 70s. In Italy, just the opposite occurred. This flipped the previous paradigm, which depicted the Italian people as a nation of anti-fascists, on its head, promoting the exact opposite view, one no less misleading or ideological. Until this moment, the public representation was centered on the idea that all the Italians were as being anti-fascist. From this point on, just the opposite. All the Italians were fascists because the fascism is what not bad, so bad. De Felice, while at times distancing himself from the zealous supporters of this revision, played a significant role in promoting this notion to the public. A critical moment is seen in the interviews De Felice gave to the journalist Giuliano Ferrara, which were published in the leading Italian daily Corriere della Sera in December 1987 and January 1988. De Felice supported the institutional reforms proposed by the socialist leader Craxi, who was favorable for a presidential republic, and contended those reforms must be accompanied by the elimination of the constitutional provision that forbade the reconstruction of the fascist party. Reforms thus were inextricably linked with the revisionist history of the regime. I quote De Felice, "The discussion of the renewal of the political system naturally encounters the issue of historical revisionism." This is words by De Felice. Affirmed De Felice, who urged that the revision be made without hesitation due to the fact that Italian fascism was, I quote, extraneous from the accusation of genocide and out of the shadow of the Holocaust. In order to construct a modern liberal democracy, according to De Felice, the country had to overcome, I quote, the official ideology of anti-fascism. The criticism in the 80s against the resistance resulted in the 90s in increasing pressure on state institutions to create a new public memory freed from the fascist anti-fascist paradigm. Again, this effort found resonance in radical political changes. Internationally, the implosion of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991 resulted in a crisis of communism. At home in Italy, With the disintegration in 1992-93 of the party system of the so-called First Republic, Prima Repubblica, shaken up by investigation of endemic corruption, leading to the disappearance or drastic reduction of all the anti-fascist political parties, from the Democratic Christians to the Communist Party, that had signed onto the Constitutional Pact. At the same time, a solid political right with no historical ties to either the resistance or anti-fascism was born. The new parties included the Northern League, Lega Nord, of Umberto Bossi, and Forza Italia of Silvio Berlusconi, along with the old Movimento Sociale Italiano, later transformed in the Alleanza Nazionale with its neo-fascist roots. This, followed by a change in the electoral law in August 1993 that transformed the proportional system into a majority system, created a bipolar political reality with one of the two poles monopolized by forces that were either hostile to anti-fascism or largely extraneous to it. This triggered a political use of history until now unseen. One of the catalysts for this war of memories was the center-right government's need to legitimize Movimento Sociale Italiano and its leader Gianfranco Fini after Berlusconi's electoral victory in 1994. Fini's party was one of the protagonists of this success, and for the first time in the post-war era, it became part of the ruling coalition. All the center-right parties rallied around coalition leader Berlusconi, from Forza Italia to the Northern League, the New Christian Democrats, and the Movimento Sociale Italiano, agreeing on a policy of neutralizing anti-fascism as a discriminating factor in political legitimization, delegitimization. In the public debate, as in the 50s, this objective was sought, claiming pacification or reconciliation of the past with the goal of creating a shared memory, una memoria condivisa. The rhetoric of pacification called on the public to either view the young Italians who aligned themselves with Mussolini after the fall of the regime in September 1943, benevolently referred to as the boys of Salò, I ragazzi di Salò, as acting on good faith or with ethical patriotism in an effort to defend the national honor, or to at least give mutual respect to all those who died in the war, irrespective of the flag they fought under. It was said that it was necessary to overcome, I quote, the counterproductive values of anti-fascism and the dramatic divisions of the Civil War. In the 90s, the President of the Republic, Christian Democrat Oscar Luigi Scalfaro, received numerous appeals to this end. It was followed by unsuccessful efforts in 2003 and 2008 to pass laws equating the fighters of the Social Republic of Mussolini with the other fighters of World War II, including the partisans. That is to claim equalization, parificazione, between fascists and anti-fascists, disregarding the radically different regions and ideals for which they had fought. Gianfranco Fini, author of the transformation of the Movimento Sociale into the National Alliance, played an important role in the politics of memory promoted by the right. Fini's goal to form a modern right based on liberalism led him to close the door on the century of ideologies consigning both fascism and anti-fascism to the history books, according to the political thesis presented at the Fuji Congress in January 1995. As the socialist intellectuals tied to Craxi had already attempted, Fini sought to replace the fascism, anti-fascism paradigm with a totalitarianism, anti-totalitarianism one. This effort carried little credibility at the moment. seeing that as late as 1994, Fini had called Mussolini, I quote, the greatest statesman of the century. And I can show you, this is the young Fini. Beside, this is Giorgio Almirante, the traditional old leader of the Movimento Sociale Italiano. And this is the cover of a book, of a Fini's book, Il Fascista del 2000. And here is Fini, and you know what he's doing. You see what he's doing. Okay. Now we arrive to this image of Fini. It's also important to note that with the introduction of anti-totalitarianism as an ideological reference point, the post-fascist right, using an interpretation taken from De Felice, from the historian De Felice, considered German Nazism and communism totalitarian, but not so Italian fascism. And they deemed the condemnation of the fascist anti-Semitism and the persecution of the Jews as sufficient to definitively dissociate fascism from the totalitarianism of the Nazis. It is of no surprise, then, that at the end of the 90s, Fini continued his path to democratic legitimacy by first visiting Auschwitz in 1999 and then Israel in November 2003. And you see the image of the visit of Fini in Israel, where he condemned, I quote, the infamous racial laws of 1938 enacted by fascism, calling them an absolute evil for their co-responsibility in the Holocaust. Fini's stance on the anti-Semitic aspects of fascism caused a break with the more nostalgic factions of the party, starting with the granddaughter of the fascist leader, Alessandra Mussolini, who went out from the Alleanza Nazionale and created a personal party. We can remember, it's important to remember here, that Fini eventually arrived at a complete condemnation of the fascist regime, not only the anti-Semitic aspect, and the Republic of Salò. However, he gradually lost political power, completely disappearing from the scene after last elections in February 2013 in Italy. La destra si riconosca nell'antifascismo is one of the last statements of Fini that created a bitter reaction in the right wing. Ok, effetto speciale. Evoluzione della specie, da figlio della lupa a padre dell'Europa. Lupa. Is it necessary to translate, or lupa is la lupa di Roma, of course. Arriva. And this is the granddaughter of Benito Mussolini, Alessandra Mussolini. Okay. In the public arena, however, the condemnation of fascist anti-Semitism functioned as a sort of purification rite, paving the way for the dissemination of a softened image of the fascist regime, widespread in the 80s, and now taking on its face in many cases of blatant rehabilitation. Having come to terms with the anti-Semitism of the regime, many right-wingers of Movimento Sociale origins felt that they had a clean slate from which to promote the historical merits of fascism. This attitude has been adopted in other political and cultural expressions of the center-right, less so among the Catholics, articulated in the most grotesque and disturbing way by Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who in an interview asserted in 2003 that, I quote, Mussolini did not murder anyone. Mussolini sent people on holiday to confine them. Mussolini mandava la gente al confino, in vacanza al confino. And I have just spoke about this, confino was mainly were the small islands such as Ponza, Maddalena, Le Tremiti, where Mussolini sent the opponents and for long years. Ho perso il punto. Okay. The attacks against anti-fascism have also found fertile ground in public opinion where the resistance and national identity has been vigorously debated. This debate was fueled by successful books from the 90s, such as La morte della patria, Death of the Homeland by Ernesto Galli della Loggia, and De Felice's Rosso e Nero, Red and Black. The authors argue against a common opinion of the resistance. For example, both found the alliance between the anti-fascist parties of the National Liberation Committee to be the origin of one of the worst vices of Italian politics, the domination of partitocracy. But above all, they stigmatized September 8, 1943, the day in which the armistice between the Italians and the Allies was announced, as the moment of death to the homeland, unlike the anti-fascist narrative, which promotes the idea of 8 September as the beginning of Italian redemption. De Felice advanced an interpretation which reduced the resistance to a civil war between two armed minorities, fascists and anti-fascists, not involving the majority of the Italian people. All of these interpretations have found plenty of ink in the leading Italian daily newspaper, Corriere della Sera. We can say that this cultural offensive promoted by the right definitively established a legitimate anti-fascist memory. We use this wording in Italy, anti-fascist, that resounded in the public square in the 90s. There was a full-on assault of the resistance in the print media and on television using traditional themes already in vogue in the 50s and the 80s, with renewed accusations against the Communist Party and the Communist partisans for having acted treacherously against other partisans, for having provoked the Nazis in violent retaliation without concern for innocent citizens, for having committed assassinations after the war on class enemies under the guise of weeding out fascists, or for being responsible, at least morally and politically, for the massacre of Italians perpetrated by the Yugoslavian communists. Another threat focused attacks on the Action Party, Partito d'Azione, one of the main forces on the left that inspired the resistance. This pounding counter-narrative often pulled out all neo-fascist cliché. For example, the center-right newspapers published dismissive judgments of September 8 as, I quote, a day of dishonor, and called the resistance a nefarious fratricidal war. These are typical words coming from the neo-fascist tradition. Not missing from the lineup are the nostalgic tributes to Mussolini as a man ready to sacrifice himself for the country by accepting leadership of the Social Republic in an attempt to curb the German thirst for revenge for having been betrayed. A typical theme of the neo-fascist memory, authoritatively endorsed by De Felice. This last one. This culture, with its underlying anti-resistance sentiments, also found expression at official levels. It is significant that Berlusconi, during his first 3 stints as prime minister up to 2006, systematically avoided celebration of April 25, the national holiday that marks the liberation of the country from fascism. And it is not surprising the former prime minister and members of his party have expressed a clear preference for April 18, the day of the election victory in 1948 of the Christian Democrat over the Socialist Communist bloc, as the true date of the birth of democracy in Italy. In fact, on many occasions, they propose replacing April the 25 with this day as a national holiday. The last one occurred in September 2011, but it was not successful. Entrenched in power since 2001, the center-right has initiated even more precise attempts to institutionalize their politics of memory in the public sphere. Among the most significant has been an attempt to rewrite history books with which they claim have been vehicles to promote the left's historiographical interpretation. Those efforts led to wide-scale protests and ultimately were abandoned. A more successful effort has been the introduction of place names throughout the nation. In the name of a reconciled past, local center-right governments have promoted the renaming of city streets, squares, and public buildings after an array of fascist personalities, as well as martyrs of the Foibe killings. And in this later case, they have done so with the support of moderate parties on the left. The last striking example for this has been the dedication of a monument in the name of war criminal Rodolfo Graziani in a small town not far from Rome, in Affile. And I can show you some image. This is Marshal Graziani, and this is the monument. You can say Patria e Onore. This monument was paid by the Regione Lazio, public money. And this is an expression of criticism, chiamate eroe un assassino. You call hero an assassin. Torno indietro. Too soon. Another effective tool in the promotion of this new political culture has been national television with the airing of TV dramas or docufiction depicting historical events, the most notable being Il Cuore nel Pozzo, The Heart in the Well, which dramatized the massacres of the Foibe. The culmination of this transformation was the introduction of two new public holidays: the Day of Remembrance on February 10th, in memory of the victims of the Foibe and of those Italians expelled from Eastern Dalmatia, and after the war, and the Day of Freedom on November 9th to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Day of Remembrance, sponsored by the National Alliance, was approved by Parliament in 2004 with lone dissent coming from the Communist parties Rifondazione Comunista and Comunisti Italiani. This act introduced into the public consciousness the memory of the Foibe, one of the cornerstones of the neo-fascist memory. We have already spoken about the Foibe in the last lectures. In the early years, the tenor of the celebrations was distinctly anti-resistance. While the dramatic events along the eastern border at the end of World War II certainly demand attention from the country, it has thus far been done without critical analysis. Neo-fascist cliché about the Foibe, described as being motivated by anti-Italian hatred on the part of the Yugoslavian government, have been adopted with no consideration of Italy's occupation of Yugoslavia from 1941 to 1943, and the war crimes committed in that period by the Italian side. Neither it was considered the anti-Slavic politics of the fascist regime before the war. The second new holiday, the so-called Day of Freedom, Giorno della Libertà, advanced by Berlusconi's Forza Italia party, was approved by Parliament in 2005. This time, the entire center-left coalition voted against the law. Designed to illustrate, I quote, the harmful effects of totalitarianism, past and present, the celebration has a clear anti-communist significance, but so far has failed to inspire the public. It is relevant to note, however, that on the first anniversary in 2006, Forza Italia released a commemorative poster illustrating the enemies of freedom, which featured Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, but omitted Mussolini, the dictator of the house. The attacks on the public memory of the resistance, led by the right, were both the cause and effect of the crisis of the so-called anti-fascist paradigm, some aspects of which had been criticized in the past by anti-fascist historians like Nicola Gallerano, with the intent of rebuilding, not destroying it. Here I'm referring to the presumed unanimity of the parties of the National Liberation Committee, or the stereotypical version of popular support for the resistance. In response to the right-wing offensive against the resistance, a vigorous defense of anti-fascism as a founding principle for the Italian Republic has been mounted since the mid-90s. On an official level, the presidents of the Republic, Scalfaro, Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, and Giorgio Napolitano, have placed limitations on right-wing requests for pacifications. They have agreed to piety toward all the fallen fighters, but with a clear distinction between those who fought for freedom and democracy and those who fought for the dictatorship. The legacy of the resistance has fueled a wave of vigorous protests in the streets, with the celebration of April 25 becoming occasions for popular mobilization. Following the election of Berlusconi in 1994, the communist newspaper Il Manifesto organized a protest against the new government in Milan. Yeah, I have the image. You see the people in the streets. And these are La rivoluzione non russa. The revolution doesn't snore. Doesn't snore. Okay. Against the new government in Milan, and in 2002, after Berlusconi's second election victory, the trade unions, especially the CGIL, organized a similar event on this day in defense of workers' rights. In 2006, numerous protests were held nationally to contest constitutional reforms promoted by the Berlusconi government, which were shot down 2 months later in a popular referendum. This demonstrates that there exists a social memory of the resistance and that is still alive in new generations. And it shows there exists an anti-fascist guarantee, un antifascismo di garanzia, the same which emerged in the 60s and in the 70s against the subversion of the neo-fascists and revived in the 90s to combat the Berlusconi government, which many saw as a threat to democracy. Another galvanizing moment in shaping public opinion was in the mid-90s when criminal cases were brought against Nazi war criminals, with the trial in Rome against ex-SS officer Erich Priebke, one of the officials responsible for the massacre at the Fosse Ardeatine, and with other cases subsequently tried by the military courts. With the memory of the Nazi-fascist massacre still alive in the country, the anti-fascist memory was relaunched and became a principal weapon against any proposal of reconciliation, advanced not just by the right, but also by moderate leftists. The memory of these German massacres drew attention to Italians as victims of Nazism. This indirectly hindered a re-examination of the national conscience regarding the crimes of Italian fascism, cementing a self-absolving image of Italians, such good people, firmly rooted in the country immediately after the war. But this alibi of the good Italian was brought into question in the 90s by new studies that delved into the most scabrous aspects of fascist Italy: colonial violence, persecution of the Jews, and crimes committed in the occupied territories during World War II. Criticism of the stereotype of colonialism with a human face found an advocate in the historian and journalist Angelo Del Boca, who inspired a 2006 legislative proposal by the Italian Communist Party, Comunisti Italiani, to dedicate a day to remember the victims of Italian colonialism, followed by another proposal by the communists to remember all victims of fascism. The electoral debacle of the radical left in the 2008 elections effectively blocked this initiative. Efforts to defend and reinforce the anti-fascist public memory managed to counter but not eliminate the anti-fascist crisis, failing to construct a regenerative reading of the resistance paradigm. I'm quoting here my friend Tommaso Bares. The new historiographical interpretation, advanced in 1991 by Claudio Pavone, put forth a three-pronged interpretation of the resistance: a war of national liberation, a civil war, and a class war. This definition wasn't adequately developed by the left in the public debate and ended up being partially co-opted and distorted by the right to show that even the anti-fascist historiography defined the resistance as a civil war. In contrast to the anti-Berlusconi movement, we also see the inverse. A number of politicians, intellectuals, and journalists from the socialist, communist, and even the old extra-parliamentary leftists jumping sides, particularly to Berlusconi's Forza Italia party, where they played an active role in the revisionist battle over memory. Noted anti-fascist journalist Giampaolo Pansa is an important example for this. Pansa didn't choose to be politically tied to the right, but with his books, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies, he was one of the main architects of the polemic against the resistance conducted under an increasingly acrimonious air. His most successful book, Il sangue dei vinti, The Blood of the Vanquished, published in 2003, intertwined narrative fiction and historical journalism to paint a bleak portrait of the violence of the partisans perpetrated against the fascists after the war. Hailed by right-wing newspapers, the Dan Brown of Italian history, as Pansa has been called by British historian Philip Cook, portrayed the resistance as a useless and ruthless civil war continued after 1945 by the will of the Communist Party, which was motivated by class hatred and revolutionary ideals. Alongside these two poles, strict opposition against Berlusconi and betrayal, there has emerged a left willing to revise the anti-fascist memory in the name of being open to a compromise. A move toward an agreement with the right has mainly come from the current majority, the ex-Communist Party transformed first into the Democratic Party of the Left, Partito Democratico della Sinistra, and finally merging with the Catholics of former Prime Minister Romano Prodi into the Democratic Party, Partito Democratico. It was precisely the ruling class that led the post-communist transition that has shown a willingness to listen more than others to entities from the right to build a shared memory, seeing it as a common ground on which to cement the new bipolar political reality. In May 1996, on the occasion of his inauguration as President of the House of Deputies, Luciano Violante, a former magistrate and Democratic Party deputy, made a speech to the chamber which had a huge impact. Violante expressed hope that the memory of the resistance could finally become a shared national value. To this end, he invited the public to listen to the feelings of the adversaries of the resistance, I quote here, to understand without falsified revisionism the motives for which thousands of young men, when all was lost, sided with Saló and not on the side of rights and freedoms. In this way, he opened a dialogue with the right to overcome conflicting memories. Another step in this direction was the vote by DS, Democrats of the Left, in 2004 in favor of the Day of Remembrance, the day for the Foibe. The unanimous decision in 2000 to establish a Holocaust Memorial Day, certainly the most important of the new public holidays, can also be read as a sign of compromise regarding memory. The law establishing the holiday has many merits and is part of a recent international trend thrusting the memory of the Holocaust onto the center stage. It is nevertheless important to recall that the text of the law does not mention either the word fascism or the word anti-fascism, and that it expressly provides for the memory of those who, I quote, even from different fields and camps, helped and protected the persecuted. As a result, the mass media is teeming with the figures of good Italians, saviors of Jews, including many good fascists. We have just seen this phenomenon in my first lesson, Giorgio Perlasca and the other. As noted by historian Stefano Pivato, the left's willingness to accept a plea bargain on the memory of the past resulted in a subdivision of memory, leading to a sort of bartering system for the construction of the national public memory. Lottizzazione delle memorie is the word used by Pivato. I don't know, the translation is very difficult. For example, the production of a drama about the Foibe killings is compensated by producing a documentary on the massacre of the Fosse Ardeatini, the Nazi massacre of the Fosse Ardeatini. The push for mutual political recognition thus follows a creation from on high of a shared memory. Expunging the most uncomfortable aspects of Italian history in the 20th century, from colonial crimes to responsibility for the actions of the Axis during the war, results in memory founded on a national self-victimization. It is what historian Giovanni De Luna has called the victimage paradigm. Marked emotional content fueled by television shows featuring the stories of survivors or families of victims of the Foibe killings, Nazi massacres, or racially related deportations which have a strong impact on the public. In the final part of my lecture, I want to explore briefly the role of the President of the Republic in creating a national memory. Neither the bitter dispute between right and left regarding the past, nor attempts at compromise undertaken by post-communists and post-fascists have generated a new master narrative. However, the President of the Republic has, with some success, made attempts to do so. A fundamental role in this regard was played by Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, who served as president from 1999 to 2006. Concerned about both the wounds caused by the conflict between Berlusconi and the opposition and the threat to national unity by the Northern League, Lega Nord, Ciampi initiated a process of civilized pedagogy via politics of memory that resulted in the recovery of the resistance as a legacy of ideals to be passed down to the younger generations, and as a historical and moral capital on which to rebuild a sense of national belonging and strengthen the unity of the country. In open disagreement with those like Galli della Loggia, who read September 8 as the death of the homeland, Ciampi reiterated the traditional tenet of the resistance as a struggle for national liberation and a second Risorgimento. In line with historiographical writings of Pietro Scoppola, the president proposed a broader vision of the protagonists of the resistance, including the partisans and soldiers who took up arms against the fascists, the people who gave them protection and support, the deportees, and the victims of massacres. Ciampi managed to highlight the patriotic character of the resistance thanks to an emphasis on the role played by the military, by those who, after the armistice, fought against the Germans, as well as those deported to Germany, but who refused to fight for the Social Republic. Not by chance, Ciampi elevated the Greek island Kefalonia, scene of the worst Nazi massacre of Italian soldiers, as one of the principal sites for the memory of the Italian resistance. Interpreted as a union of the people and the armed forces, the resistance was reaffirmed as the origin for the Constitution by Ciampi and seen as the basis for renewed patriotism in the Republic, with the rediscovery of national symbols such as the flag and national anthem. I can show you. Here is Ciampi celebrating Liberation Day. You can see the national flag everywhere and no red flag. Usually during the celebration on 25 April, there were always mixed together national flag and red flag, communist flag. And now we see just national flag. It's very important also that during the institutional ceremonies, you can never hear Bella Ciao. Do you know Bella Ciao? The very famous song of the resistance. The band plays only the national hymn, Inno di Mameli. And it was very shocked for me. I have just said that three weeks ago, I was here in Belgium, in Liège, for a conference on the persecutions and anti-fascism in Italy. And there were an institutional happening in the very beautiful palace in Liège with all the authorities, Belgian authorities of the region. And after the speeches, they have put the Bella Ciao, with Bella Ciao. And all there were many Italians with me, and we were very shocked in a positive way, because in Italy we never heard Bella Ciao in the institutional buildings. Very impressive for me. This is all within the framework of constructing a complete memory based not only on the resistance, but also the Risorgimento, World War I, and the victims of the Foibe massacres. Following the footsteps of Ciampi, his successor, Giorgio Napolitano, one of the leaders of the former Communist Party, praised the Risorgimento and the national patriotic resistance, not without silencing the dark side relating to the Civil War, with particular reference to the post-war revenge killings stigmatized in Pansa's books. In the face of growing credibility problems of the political parties, the voice of the presidents has emerged in recent years as a focal point for a nation at the mercy of regressive dynamics and the syndrome of decline. But now also Napolitano has problems in Italy. The actions of the President of the Republic were decisive in thwarting the most radical attacks by the right, seeking to abolish the April 25 Liberation Day holiday and to equate the fighters of Salò and the partisans. Liberation Day has remained in its place, even if it has lost some of its relevance. given the emergence of antagonistic memories, such as that of the Foibe massacres, or competing ones like that of the Holocaust. Still today, institutional legitimacy can't ignore reference to the resistance. However, the links between the resistance and anti-fascism and its role of democratic renewal are more and more tenuous. The word anti-fascism itself is nearly completely absent in the speeches of Ciampi and Napolitano, as if, merely speaking, it throws up a barrier to constructing the coveted shared memory. Thus, the country that gave birth to fascist totalitarianism continues to postpone its showdown with the legacy of its past. And it is the lack of such a showdown that makes it possible for Berlusconi to pronounce statements like he did last year regarding the alleged merits of Il Duce and his regime. Thank you very much.
You invoked at the beginning of your lecture that in Santoro's TV show, young Italians have a sort of indulgent vision of fashions. So what is it like in Italian education? Do the fascist period have, is it recurrently studied in the scholar programs? How it is shown in the school books? Has there been an evolution such as the one that you've pointed out in public opinions in education as well?
Thank you very much. Yes, the fascist past is very present in the school text, but what lacks is a reflection on the crimes, fascist crimes. In the school text, you don't find nothing about the crimes during the Second World War committed by the Italians in the occupied territories in Yugoslavia and Greece. No words. And you can find something about the crimes committed in Ethiopia, but very, very little. And I think there is a problem because in the historians and also in some part the school text give a precise image of the fascism. They condemn fascism, but out in the public sphere, in the public debate, in the public discourse, there is another image, very benevolent. It's the image that Berlusconi showed in the statement I referred to. This is the problem. Of course, it should be very, very important to introduce in the school books more attention to the aspects, to the dark aspects of the fascism. But it's very complex, I think, the question.
Thank you. More questions? I have a question then. You have insisted on reconciliation in Italy, reconciling memories of the right and memories of the left, of fascism and anti-fascism, but you haven't mentioned European reconciliation. In a way, it is surprising that Italy has a Freedom Day commemorating the fall of the Berlin Wall, which has a priori nothing to do with Italian history. Yeah. It is happening quite far away from what happens in Italy. But the tendency to insist on how evil the Germans are seems to be incompatible with the idea that maybe Italian memories and German memories somehow have to reconcile. And one could say, well, in France and Britain at the least, 1989 was also a moment of fear of German unification. Apparently, the reconciliation between Italy and Germany is not very high on the agenda. But one could ask, what about the enlargement of 2004, about relationships between Italy and Slovenia, but then also Italy and Greece? So how how is European reconciliation on the agenda, or is it not at all part of the memory debates in Italy? How to build a European memory that reconciles us with the Germans, with the Slovenes, with the Croatians, and with the Greeks?
Oh, thank you very much. This aspect of the reconciliation on a European level is emerged just in the last years, and in a very traumatic way, I think, because the Italian public memory of the Second World War has been, in the last 20 years, very, very centered on itself. It is not you can see this in the obsession on the new patriotic memory. Also, the resistance by Ciampi is a neo-patriotic resistance. And in 2007, there was a big problem between Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia after a statement by the President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano. It was the first year of his mandate, I don't know. And he celebrated the day of the remembrance for the Foibe and the Italians expelled from Eastern Dalmatia. And he read a discourse, terrible. Napolitano, as I said, came from the Communist Party, Italian Communist Party. And he read a discourse that was full of, in some way, hatred, very critical expressions against the Slovenians, like that was written by a fierce nationalist, Italian nationalist. Maybe the first Fini could have written this discourse. And this discourse provoked a diplomatical crisis with Slovenia and Croatia. And from that moment on, there has been some changes in the attitude of Napolitano. He refused this condemnation of the Slavic hatred, etc., etc., and began to organize some acts of reconciliation. For example, in 2010, there was a very important concert in Trieste, in Piazza Unità d'Italia, the most important square in Trieste. There was a band formed by Slovenian, Italian, Croatian musicians, 300 people. And in that occasion, President Napolitano with the President of Slovenia and the President of Croatia, before the concert in the morning, makes two important symbolic acts. They went together to the place where, at the beginning of the 20s, the Italian fascists burned the Slovenian House of the People, Narodni Dom, and then together, the three presidents went to another spot in the city where there is a monument that in honor of the Italian expelled by the Yugoslavians after the war. So this was a first act of reconciliation, and after this there were another acts in the years following. There is no political how to say, policy, but some signs, interesting signs of reconciliation.
Now, Silvio Berlusconi was also famous in European media for treating Martin Schulz as capo. Was there a lot of reaction in the Italian media for this violently anti-German abuse by Berlusconi?
Oh, as you know, the main part of Italian media were controlled by Berlusconi, so lots of them sustained Berlusconi, and the other condemned his with high criticism, but it's not all Italy. And you mentioned the problem of the reconciliation between Italy and Germany, very complex question. There has been a bilateral commission that in the last, of historians that have worked in the last years to, for developing a shared memory, reconciled memory, reconciled memory between Germany and Italy. And the commission had made some suggestions in order to build some monuments in Berlin, recalling the Italians, the fate, the destiny of Italian soldiers interned in Nazi German camps during the war, and such of these acts. It's also very important the bilateral visits that are the German politicians, authorities has done in Italy. Many of them, the presidents of the Republic, I think all the German presidents of the Republic have done a visit in Italy to one of the spot where there was Nazi massacres during the war. For example, Sant'Anna di Stazzema, Marzabotto. Also Martin Schulz has came, I think, last year. And it's very, very, very important for it.
So maybe just for the students, so Martin Schulz is now one of the two candidates to head the European Commission and to take the place of Barroso, and who was the leader of the socialist group in the European Parliament, had criticized Berlusconi and in the European Parliament, and Berlusconi had then treated him as capo, and the capos are the inmates in charge of discipline in the concentration camps. So this was a quite violent statement. Any other questions? Kenneth?
I have a very naive question. It does not concern reconciliation, but rather the competition of memories. I was always struck when I was going to Italy about the role and the weight of the memory of the Anni di Piombo in the 70s, or the terrorism, Brigate Rosse, and everything. So, very naive question. I don't have any clue. To what extent has the memory of the Anni di Piombo has a bit overshadowed the memory of the Second World War? Is there a role there, or nothing really linked?
Very good question, because we can observe that in the last years, the weight of the memory of the Anni di Piombo, of the terrorist years in the 70s, is growing of importance in Italy. But at the moment, the memory of the Second World War remain at the center of the stage in some ways. But it's very important. And in Italy, in the last 10 years, has been introduced lots of new holidays. We have to make distinction. These days are not national holidays, but we say solennità civili. I don't know, it's a distinction. For example, very, very nice. in these days, the school remain open. Otherwise, for the national holiday like 25 April, the schools are closed. And one of the new feste civili introduced in the last decade is a day of commemoration for the victims of the terrorism and of the mafia together. And in this case, Giorgio Napolitano, the president, worked a lot for a reconciliation between the victims of both terrorism, left terrorism and wing terrorism. It was very important in 2007 or 8. The new day of commemoration was introduced in 2007. I think the years following, 2008, there was a meeting at the Quirinale, the presidency, the building, and there was a meeting, un incontro, meeting between two widows of a policy officer, very famous, Pinelli, you know, Pinelli, who was shot by leftist terrorism, and the widow of the other, I don't know, remember. No. Calabresi. The widow of Calabresi, that was a policy officer, and the widow of Pinelli, that was an anarchist who died falling down from the police department in Milan, and of course it was killed. And there are many stories about this. And these two widows met together. It was very important. But what is important regarding this aspect is that there is a very important is the role played by the association of the families of the victims of terrorism. And this is a good aspect for our historians, because they want not the memory, but they want to know la verità, the truth. We want to know who killed because you know that in Italy, lots of the episodes of terrorist killings, most of them very cruel, like the Bologna massacres, over than 80 victims, are still unknown. The responsibilities are still unknown, and there is omissions. How do you say omissions? Omissions is the state says that these acts have to remain secret. We use the Latin terms omissis. So this association of the families ask to know the truth. It's very important because it means that all the documents have to be put to, have to come out, declassified.
Thank you. This is your last chance for a question. Anybody? Not just the students. In that case, I can just thank Filippo Focardi very warmly for those 8 hours of lectures which he has offered us. I think we have all appreciated just the breadth of the exposés, allowing us to get to know much more about, well, fascist Italy, Italy's war, the crimes, but then also the way this has been dealt with after the war, taking us from 1945 until 2014. And I think we've all appreciated the critical spirit, but then also I think the very neutral and critical tone coming up to the present. So I think this was a great example for all of us and a great discovery. Thank you very much, Filippo.